was fully convinced that we were God's chosen people. Our father was the leader of a Mormon religious cult.
Our dad had 13 wives.
He was more revered than Jesus.
Hey everyone, so this video is starting off a brand new series. We finished all the recaps of Escaping Polygamy and those episodes, and now we are going to be reviewing Daughters of a Cult. It just came out on Hulu. It's a series that follows the story of the Lebaron group. That is another polygamist cult, smaller polygamist cult that is completely separate, a whole different group of people or families that have taken the doctrine of the Mormons and kind of started living them in their own way. So the Lebaron group, originally they would go by like their name of their church, so-called, would be the Church of the Firstborn, which is funny because when you look into the history of how it got started, it actually got started with, or very early in the beginning of the leadership of this church, or this cult, then the younger brother kills his older brother, which was the firstborn, so that he could be the prophet of the group. So this group, even though it was a lot smaller than the FLDS, Warren Jeff's group, or the AUB, Apostolic United Brethren, or the Order Kingston group, this Lebaron group, or the Church of the Firstborn, it got a lot of attention because of the public crimes that they would do and the people that they ended up killing to kind of like show their dominance in the world, or to show their presence, that they actually were, you know, an established religion, and that they truly felt they were God's chosen people and the one and only true gospel of God to preach to the world. And a lot of it, of course, in fact, from what I can tell, all of it was sanctioned and encouraged, or even planned and plotted, all by the prophet, the leader. And the leader of this group is Ervil Lebaron. Technically, his older brother was the one that got it started and began their section, or their break off from the Mormon church, and started their own little cult. But then Ervil, soon after, kills his older brother to be the leader, and he was the leader for the majority of the group's history and the time that they were, I guess, just becoming a church and trying to become an established religion or cult. There's a lot to break down, and I want to start with the names of the leaders of these different cults, because the names are a little bit unusual, names that we might have not heard before. I had the hardest time figuring out how to properly say Ervil Lebaron, and he has a lot of beef with the other leaders of other polygamous groups, so I think it's important to know those ones. So of course we have the Church of the Firstborn that started with their prophet of Joel Lebaron, and then soon after Ervil Lebaron took over. And then they run into and have a lot of beef with the Apostolic United Brethren, the AUB polygamous group, which started off with Joseph Misuse, and then eventually Rulon Alred became the prophet, and then Owen Alred. And then there was a debate between the Jensen and the Lynn Thompson leaders. I think there must have been some sort of a break off at that point, because it's not very clear who was appointed prophet of that group. And then from there we have the FLDS, another group that was Leroy Johnson, Rulon Jeffs, and then now currently Warren Jeffs is the leader of the Mormon fundamentalist FLDS, Warren Jeffs group. And then of course there's the Order, the polygamous group that I was born and raised in. That one started off with a brother Eldon Kingston, which I think it was in conjunction with his father Charles Kingston. Them together kind of got it started. But Eldon was essentially the first ever appointed prophet, and then there was Ortel, and now there is Paul Kingston, who is the living leader of that group. So there's all these different leaders of the different polygamist groups. And another thing to keep in mind is most people associate these groups with Utah, which makes sense. The majority of them all started and live and have their members in Utah. But the Lebaron group, even though they did come to Utah a lot and they had small settlements in Utah, they technically started in Mexico. And they had a small group in Mexico and a small little branch in California. And then as you watch the series, you see kind of how he did move to Colorado, moved to places in Utah, kind of moved all around once he needed to go into hiding, was trying to not get arrested. The Lebaron group is a little bit more unique in that aspect, but the principles and the origination still comes from the Mormon LDS religion and history. So, cool. Okay, so with the background out of the way, let's kind of dive into the series. I'm just going to go through watching it. I've already seen the entire series. There's only like 5 episodes. They only have season 1 out right now. It was really intriguing. I liked it quite a bit. It caught my attention enough to really want to do my next series on these episodes and to really just kind of like dive deep into the comparison of a lot of the different polygamous groups, but then also why this one stood out so much. The Lebaron group was so small, a tiny group of people, but they drove the other groups crazy. They literally like struck fear into a lot of the other polygamous groups because of just how crazy they were and what extreme lengths they would go to get their way and to try and persuade people or convince people that they were the true prophet of God, right? Let's dive into it. Let's see how crazy this gets.
Our dad had 13 wives. And father,
supposedly
14. It's 14. We counted finally.
I actually don't know how many brothers and sisters I have, and it depends on how you count.
Okay, so straight off in the beginning of the episode, they talk about how large their family was, because a lot of the information and the stories being shared are from the direct children of Ervil Lebaron. And they mentioned that he had 13 wives and roughly around 50 children. And they go on to talk about how much the rules and regulations of the group were being like in their like upbringing and teaching them when they were growing up, but also how it was just such a thing to try and one up one another on how righteous you were. And it just kind of goes to show the way that the parents kind of used that almost like a tactic to try and get the kids to want to constantly compete on who could be the more righteous person and who could basically become like their father's right-hand person, like their favorite child in essence, you could say. It is interesting though, they don't mention if there was a favorite wife. If I would have been in this interview, I would have asked them if they knew, if it stood out who the favorite was and what they all thought about that, you know. But yeah, they don't mention that with their family, so maybe it was viewed a little bit different. But from my experience with polygamous families, there's always a favorite.
We just say over 50 children because nobody really knows the exact number.
People come up with different numbers depending on different circumstances.
So I am my own cousin because I am my uncle's son and my aunt's son. So my siblings are my siblings, but they're also my cousins. It gets weird.
Polygamist math is hard.
Ooh, okay. It shows a little bit of their family tree. So I'm going to read some of the names because any polygamous people watching this probably have ties or relations to some of these family members. But they have Ervil Lebaron, Yolanda, Linda Lebaron, Rena, Teresa. Oh, that's an interesting one. Rosemary, Anna, Joy, Maria, and Delphina. Ervil Moral Lebaron. First of all, his first name sounds like it's evil. Ervil, evil. And then moral, like he's supposed to be a moral person or something. And Lebaron. Ray Johnson, interesting. Robert Stilson, and Andrew McDonald. Huh. Okay.
By the end of this video, it is going to be really confusing.
He was born February 22nd, 1925 in Mexico. Galena, Mexico.
Many people in America can say their house has been raided by the FBI multiple times.
We're not proud of this fact, by the way, just to be clear.
No, but it's part of our story. It's part of the reason why we're sitting here, because this was our life. This was what we lived.
Okay, so that's something interesting I want to point out. When we are seeing the kids talking about how their family was like going through all these crazy things, had to move so that their father could stay in hiding, how their homes got raided by the FBI, they almost look like they're excited to tell this story. Like, this is so like crazy, you know? And then one of the other daughters, which I'm guessing is the older sibling, is like, we didn't like this though. Like we sound like super excited to talk about it because they weren't able to talk about it their whole life. They hated the fact that they had to do all this growing up and that they didn't have much of a relationship with their father. And they came to realize a lot of these differences because they do point out that when they were growing up in it, it was normal. So they didn't really know that they hated it. They thought it was an honor to hide their father in the closet or to, you know, lie to the police and keep them off of their father's trail and stuff. So now looking back on it, they realized that it really messed with them mentally growing up and that they didn't get to really develop their own personalities of who they are and what their beliefs are. But at the time growing up, they were also manipulated and taught that that's the way that you live, that's the way that you're a good person. So they viewed it very differently then.
Only recollections of life as a child, it was being on the run from the law. Of course, I didn't know we were on the run from the law.
What? So one of the daughters says that they didn't even know they were on the run from the law. So I wonder what the excuse was, why they were moving all the time.
Family history, you do have to go back to Mexico. I was born in Colonia, Lebaron, Chihuahua, Mexico.
That's one thing that's similar with a lot of the polygamist groups and with my family in particular. They were all born at home births. And a lot of the polygamist groups do that just because they claim it's more natural. They don't want any like medicine or modern surgeries or things like that. They want it to just be natural at home, and it's cheaper too. So a lot of the polygamist groups just have their kids all at home.
House, there was no running water. In order to get water, we had to pump it out of a well.
And we would have a big galvanized tub that we would bathe in once a week.
Interesting. So from the children's first home that they can remember living in, they were very poor. They lived a very poor lifestyle, saying that they didn't even have running water. They had to go and fetch the water. Just the type of home that they lived in was very small, very close quarters. They didn't have a lot of things, which is interesting because, like I said, I've already seen the series and seen where, like, how big and nice of a house they end up in by the end of, before their father gets caught and taken. They essentially, and I feel like this is an important part because this can even be a part of the motivator as to why their dad wanted to be the prophet so bad, wanted to have this power and authority that oftentimes come with financial benefit. But they clearly started off very poor, and throughout his leadership and him growing this following, he does become better off financially. So I could totally see that as a huge motivator of him for a reason for him to want to claim to be this prophet.
Very primitive. We didn't have a lot. We never wore shoes. We didn't have electricity. The closest town to the colony was like an hour away. The colony was very isolated, didn't leave it hardly ever.
They didn't even have electricity in their first house. That's pretty extreme. They lived out in the middle of nowhere. The closest other group of people was over an hour away. So they were very secluded.
My father, Ervil, along with his brother, Uncle Joel, they established the Church of the Firstborn of the Fullness of Times.
The Church of the Firstborn of the Fullness of Times is like the full official name that they gave it.
Establishing Zion, a gathering place for people who wanted to practice the law of plural marriage, because polygamy is illegal in America.
Joel, Lebaron, establish it and start their own church, supposedly, in Mexico. And they're using essentially all of the LDS stuff. They're using the LDS doctrine, even to the point where they are printing off LDS scriptures, the LDS Book of Mormon. So they're using all of the Mormon stuff. That's why it's very clear that it's a Mormon LDS breakoff, but they are changing who the leader is. And I think there's a reason why the Mormon LDS faith gets used in a lot of other religious breakoffs or religious groups. And I personally feel like it's because of that's essentially how the LDS church starts. The doctrine itself points out scriptures and really highlights the fact that there was this restoration. There was a new church established by God, not from any history, not from any, previous religious leaders or anything like that. It literally is just a brand new, fresh start to an establishment of a church. And so using the exact same doctrine as the Mormons, I feel like it was pretty easy for them to be like, yeah, all this Mormon doctrine is true except for the name of the person who restored it. They just put their own name, basically black out Joseph Smith, right? Who is the original Mormon LDS restorer prophet, and they put whatever name they want. Most of the groups put their own name on it and claim that all the doctrine is true, the restoration's correct, those gospel principles are all correct, and the scriptures are true, but it is them that are the prophet, the ones receiving revelation, the one that gets to be God's spokesperson for the world. And essentially, most of the groups do that. That's why it's so easy for them to break off and do their own thing, because they can just kind of blur that line of who's the prophet, but still go off of all the same scriptures, but copy and paste the whole outline of the Mormon church and create their own break off of the Mormon church. And so that's my thoughts on why I feel like this happens so much in so many different groups. But of course, there's also a lot of things with power, and we're going to see even in this small Lebaron group, they break off multiple times because they get upset about who the leader is or want someone else to be the prophet, because the prophet is just given so much power and authority. The kids constantly talk about how their dad was in control of everything. He wanted everything to be a particular way. He had full control over that. And if people didn't listen to him, he had the authority and the power to cut them off, to excommunicate them, to really just shun and destroy their family or their whole life, really. So the prophets are given a lot of power, and a lot of people fight for that, basically. Another thing, though, that I think is interesting is the fact that this Lebaron group takes place in Mexico, where polygamy is legal. So my first thought is like, okay, so if polygamy is legal out there, it should be much easier for them. They should be able to market their church, advertise it and not get in trouble, not get shut down by the law or get arrested, because technically it's legal. But they still run into issues because of the greed. So it's not just the polygamy aspect. There's so much more to it with the children, the neglect that happens with them, with the families getting so big, and then with the power and the finances, because the money is always put in a pot. And essentially it's supposed to be everyone's money gets into one location and then gets shared, but it always ends up having someone become greedy, and people end up taking, different proportions of shares, and some people get left with nearly nothing. And so there's so many more issues to trying to run this type of religious group of people than just the fact that, polygamy is legal, and polygamy, of course, there's so many issues with the relationships and all that. But even in a place where polygamy is completely legal and people in the area are okay with it, it still doesn't work out. It still runs into their issues. And we're going to see that happening even in this Lebaron group.
I was born in Chihuahua, Mexico, south of the El Paso border, in the Lebaron colony. I'm the daughter of Verlin Lebaron, brother of Joel and Ervil. He was the baby of the family. My father ended up fathering 58 children.
The 3 degrees of heaven, they just talked about that they were taught that growing up in the Lebaron group, and they also teach that highest one, of course, tied to the plural marriage lifestyle that they live. They need to live.
My father was a mainstream Mormon, and he was converted, moved to Colonial Lebaron. His money, a lot of it was going to help support especially Uncle Ervil's family, and that's how faithful my father was.
Okay, that's interesting. One of the older siblings that was able to recall it and was there when people were actually converting to the group is talking about how pretty much all of the people that joined Ervil Lebaron's little group converted from the mainstream Mormon LDS church. So they're essentially taking the members from one church into theirs. So I think that's kind of interesting. But that's good to notice, because that makes a lot of sense. If someone already understands the Mormon doctrine, then to translate it into their doctrine. It's of course still crazy to think that they would go from one extreme to an even more strict and more extreme religion, but it happens. And I think that's at least an easier step than someone that's doesn't understand the Mormon doctrine, doesn't believe in or even know or anything about the whole gospel principles of those churches, it would be much harder to try and convince them or get them on board with your religion and your ideas.
He was really busy at the time building his brother Joel's church. But little by little, the more money that was brought in, the more Uncle Erbil enjoyed his power.
And you know, that's extra strange when you think of the fact that the mainstream LDS church is so big on missionary work, on sending people out all across the world to teach people their beliefs and their doctrine and get them to be baptized and join their church. And then there's these smaller sects just kind of like using that, like having the mainstream church convert people to this overall religion of the LDS belief, and then they kind of like go and try and convert them to their own version of that religion. So it's like a two-step program here. It's kind of weird, but yeah, I feel like that happens with a lot of these polygamous groups because that's the only way they can really get people to want to be a part.
He had this real nice gold car. My mom and a bunch of people, they used to refer to it as the golden calf. I never saw him work a day in his life.
Okay, so now they're pointing out, after talking about Erbil kind of being the main guy going out and converting people, getting people to join the church and convincing them to pay their tithing to the church and to the prophet, then they notice that he goes out and buys this really nice fancy car. They call this golden car or whatever. And that's when a lot of the people start to kind of point the finger at like who's taking the money or like who has the power or what's going on, because now there's finally, it sounds like they're getting just enough people to finally have this pot of money that everyone's putting their money in, and it's becoming a decent amount. And of course Erbil, the main head guy, the first ones to go out and use that money to buy something fancy. And they're also pointing out that he didn't have a job even at this time. So in essence, his job was to go and convert people. And he got to spend their tithing money, is what it looks like.
A lot of people had a big problem with the fact that Erbil wasn't working and lifting a finger to support his always growing family. It was creating this very untenable situation.
Wow. So it's just becoming extremely obvious that there's a problem. So Erbil not only has the majority of the wives, has many, many children, doesn't even have a job to support them, and he's one of the first ones to go out and buy one of the fanciest cars in the group. Yeah, it's making it super obvious where everybody's money is going.
Uncle Erbil, he started having all kinds of revelations and claims. We had a prophet.
So even going that extreme was not enough to make people start like fighting against Erbil. Even though it was very clear he was using the money and it was an unfair distribution of everybody's money in the pot, that still wasn't enough to get the people to want to start leaving or to start dividing up the group. But it also isn't enough for Erbil. Eventually, he starts creating his own prophecies. And remember, at this point in time that they're talking about, he still isn't the prophet. He is the brother of the prophet. The prophet at this time is his older brother, Joel. Erbil is a little bit more charismatic, more talkative than his older brother, so he can get his way just as much. It sounds like he's had just as much power and influence as his older brother. But it's when he starts claiming the prophecies. And anyone that comes from a religious background knows that this is a huge deal. People can overlook being taken advantage of by their money, basically having things stolen from them, and someone completely abusing their power financially. But once it comes to the actual revelation, speaking for God, that is a huge deal in any religion, because now they are trying to overpower the prophet that is supposed to be the only one that can receive revelation directly from God.